Shabbat Shalom. In 8 days, I'll be heading back to Israel to spend a few weeks studying at the Shalom Hartman Institute. One of the great privileges of my rabbinate is the opportunity to learn there from some of the finest Jewish scholars in the world, but I've also learned something else over the years, which is that every time I go to Israel, I come home, and one of the people who I end up quoting most often are the cab drivers. It may be because Israelis are natural storytellers. It's also because in Israel, everyone carries a piece of the country's story with them. There is one conversation from a taxi ride in November 1990, in November 2023, that I don't think I'll ever forget. It was just a month after October 7th. We were chatting, the cab driver and I. He was a van driver, and he mentioned that yesterday, the day before, he had been in Gaza. The day before, he was in combat, and today he was driving a van of American rabbis. I remember thinking how different that is from our experience in America. Our soldiers leave home and they go to bases and they get on to ships and they deploy overseas, and there is a distance between ordinary life and war. In Israel, people drive to the front line, park their cars, and go into combat. You can be fighting one day and back at work the next. And I remember wondering, what does that do to a person's soul? I think our Torah portion asks the same question, not about a soldier, but about Moses. Parshat Chukat opens chapter 20 with the following words. Vayavo b'nei Yisrael kol ha'edah, all the children of Israel, the whole community in Midbar Sin, came to the wilderness of Sin in the first month, and they stayed in Kadesh, vatamot sham Miriam vatikaver sham, and Miriam died there, and she was buried. And there was no water for the community, and the community gathered against Moses and Aaron. Miriam dies, and then the water disappears. From this, the Midrash tells us that there was a well that followed Bnei Israel through the wilderness by the merit of Miriam that disappears when she dies, and immediately the people start complaining, and Moses and Aaron are expected to solve another crisis, and then Moses does something that he has not done before in the same way, which is that he lashes out. We don't know exactly what the sin was. He strikes the rock. Maimonides says that his sin was getting angry, but rather than asking what was Moses' sin, maybe we should ask what happened to Moses. There's an amazing midrash that says Moses yells at the people, Shimuna Morim, listen now, you rebels. And the midrash says, if you listen and look at the word Morim, you hear the word Miriam. That Moses is lashing out at the people, angry, but he is also feeling the grief over his sister's death. He is heartbroken, exhausted. He never had a chance to grieve. He never got what I want to call this morning his chapter 19. Because if you look at the Torah portion this morning, it doesn't begin with chapter 20. It begins with chapter 19. It's a strange chapter in which the Torah describes something called the para aduma. It is, by the rabbis say, the definition of incomprehensible. It doesn't make any sense. There's no logic behind it. But the purpose of this ritual is to help purify a person after they come in contact with a dead body. And the rabbis try to understand, why is this chapter 19 here? And they notice something else. Chapter 20 begins, Vayavo b'nei Israel. It could just say the children of Israel came to Midbar Tzim, but it says Kol ha'edah, all of the community. And they're wondering, why does it tell you all the community? And they answer a question that is very difficult to figure out, which is, where did the 38 years go? And what they say is, between last week's Torah portion in Parshat Korach, 38 years have passed, and all of the people who came out of Egypt and who were condemned to die in the desert have now died. And when it says Kol ha'edah, the whole community arrived at Midbar Tzim, it means this is now the whole community that will enter into the land of Israel. But in the meantime, there has been death, and the Torah places chapter 19 there to place a separation between death and life. Because the Torah knows that if we carry death everywhere, eventually death begins to shape how we live. Death deserves our attention, our tears, our memory, but death cannot be allowed to become the only lens through which we see the world. And that's why there's chapter 19, because we need separation and space and time to grieve. Later in the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, the Torah says that when soldiers return from battle, they don't simply walk back into the camp. They purify themselves and they stay an evening, not because they have sinned, but because war changes people. Long ago, I think the Torah understood what we call trauma. Last week, I was at Camp Ramah Darom. I was mainly checking labels for the food that comes into the kitchen, but they put me to work doing a little teaching, and they asked me to moderate a panel, and there were 7th and 8th graders who had the chance to ask a group of Israeli staff members who were on staff anything that they wanted to, and one of them asked, "Can you tell me where you were on October 7th?" And one of the counselors described how he got a call that morning from his unit, and how he went to the south, and at 11 a.m., one of the first, he was in the kibbutzim battling Hamas. And as I listened, I found myself humbled, sitting 2 seats from a young boy who has spent the last 2.5 years in a world I can only begin to imagine. And I looked around the room at that moment, and I saw this young boy who had those experiences, and I also saw children smiling. I saw summer camp and friends and Shabbat, and it struck me that those precious few weeks for him at Camp Ramah Darom and his Israeli brothers and sisters were for him chapter 19. A sacred space, a chance, even for a little while, to step away from death and to remember what life feels like. Israelis and American Jews have had very different experiences these last 2.5 years. And for many Israelis, there's been no chapter 19. There's been reserve duty and missiles and rockets, and then back to work and family and another call up. There have been funerals and shivas, and then school and the grind of daily life. And maybe one of the most important things that we can offer our fellow Jews is not just advocacy or our generosity, but it is a commitment in our hearts and in our souls to support places and people that make healing possible. And to pray that those who have carried so much will once again have the room to breathe, to heal, and to remember what life feels like again. This morning, we also celebrate Annette's 90 years of life. In preparation for today, Amy gathered, as she mentioned, some reflections from some of Annette's many friends. You'll read some of them in a few minutes. Laura Gutman recalled something that Annette once told her about her own mom, how as a young girl, Annette's mom had just happened to be visiting some relatives in America when it became impossible for her to return home to Germany. That chance trip saved Annette's mom's life while much of the rest of her family perished in Europe. Annette reflected on her mother, saying she was never, ever depressed. She was deeply grateful for every day of her life. That was because her life was a special gift. I think of her life as a chapter 19, a sacred space between the death of Europe and what created you, Annette. 90 years of beautiful life anew for your family. Your life is a gift. You raised 3 beautiful daughters. You fulfilled the mitzvah of Hachnasat Orchim. Arna Lefkowitz wrote from afar about how whenever a new Jewish family would move to Durham, Annette would invite them into her home, gather longtime Bethel members around the table, introduce everyone, and how she got most of them to join. She says, "We met the Lazaruses and the Rosenbergs at your house and remained great friends." In 8 days, as I said, I'll return to Israel to study wise texts and with extraordinary scholars, but I'm reminded that the most important lessons are not found in books or classrooms. They are found in listening and watching and learning carefully and humbly from the holy lives of people who surround us. From cab drivers, from Israeli counselors, from mothers and daughters and granddaughters who make sacred space for others to heal and grow, and who over and over again fulfill the verse, Uvacharta b'chayim. We should choose life so that we and our children may live. Shabbat Shalom.